the EscapeGoat podcast, a podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. Hello! I'll just do it again, that was a weird hello.
Mate, this all goes in now. This is all recording gold. This is why the people turn up, David.
It's authentic, isn't it? Alright, well, hello. This is episode 65 of the EscapeGoat podcast, and we're coming back with these for at least a couple after a little gap because we've been doing our, I guess, now, well, I was going to say now regular, but final, really, and ninthly episodes because we just, me and John and a couple of guests took a break to do the last episodes of Inside Number 9, the British comedy drama TV show, which wrapped up this summer, and that was good fun. But I was always planning to come back with a few more in Series 5 of the EscapeGoat podcast, just looking for the right collaborators and subjects. And I found a doozy because I am very, 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 very happy to welcome back the rather fabulous James Murphy, who's been on this podcast before. Hello, James. How are you?
Hi, David. I'm really good. I'm really pleased to be here as well. It's a subject that's, as will become clear throughout the conversation, near and dear to my heart. And I think it's going to be a nice chat.
Very nice. Well, I know I've been chatting to you a little bit over messages about this on and off for a couple of years now, so I knew you were one of the people to seek out to talk about it, and I think it's fair to say that this is one of those curate's egg mixed bags, let's face it, fairly flawed works that I think make for interesting podcast topics, so that's good. I mean, that's putting it mildly almost in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Let's find out where we stand.
But we've already had a little bit of a chat off mic, but I just wanted to ask you, how you doing? How are you enjoying the summer?
So far, so good, yeah. I'm really, really blessed now that I have something of a back garden which I share with the upstairs neighbours, but they have no interest in it. They don't even put their clothes out to dry in it. So the second I've got a 15-minute break at work, I'm straight onto the sun lounger, top off, trying to get some vitamin D desperately into this pale body of mine, just hoping to try and get some energy. So the act of going out to the garden and lying there for 15 minutes, there's no need to go to Ibiza. Roads, you can keep it, I say. Benidorm, back you go. It's all about popping into your own garden and then coming back into your own house and not having to think about anyone else either. So it's a bit of a golden summer in that respect. Yeah,
it is, and I think one in which we need that bit of relief, actually, because I mean, just for the sake, it's been a month or so since we've even recorded the Inside Number 9 ones, but we are recording this for the record in July 2024, which has been quite the year so far in both UK. Me and James both live in the UK, in UK domestic politics, and obviously anyone listening to this around about now or in years to come will know it was quite a dramatic time for American politics as well. And I know you're a follower of both, James. So have you been using the sunbathing to de-stress from all of that?
There's that as well. There absolutely is. It does feel there's that phrase polycrisis, and the various elections, they don't have that element to them because there's essentially a 50% chance that things will get very, very marginally better, or at least not yet exponentially worse. So while you can't really describe it as a feeling of polycrisis, there is also this kind of just overwhelming constancy of things that I find extraordinarily interesting, but also have people's lives riding on them. Like, I really, really wish I was into sports. I wish I had that part of my brain functioning, because I could take this stuff out, watch some people kick a ball around the field, and then I'd have all of this stuff burnt out, and it wouldn't matter a jot. My team could win, some other team could lose, and people's material lives would be fine. But I'm the person who thinks politics is interesting, if albeit mostly cloaked in corporate disguise in theatre. I still think it is an interesting thing that, of course, has a huge effect on people's lives day to day. And I can't help but feel guilty when I get a serotonin boost when there's a huge news story and I get to follow up on it later.
Yeah, no, I feel the same. I think your thing with football, I remember watching one of those reality shows a few years ago that was about ceramics, and it was one of those things where I could get interested in it for 20 minutes at a time, but I was like, imagine I could get really interested in this. This feels healthy,
Yeah, that's the way to be spending time. None of your, reading biographies of the President of the United States. None of that nonsense. Give me a plate. Let me paint it in a way that will express my heart. And I think we'll all go home happier afterwards.
Yeah, maybe get Johnny Vegas to guest judge it or something. Just get a bit of.
We got a show. Let's go to the BBC right now.
A bit of expertise. He must have been asked to guest star on Pottery podcast. That must be.
It's his passion, man. He wouldn't do it. It means too much to him for him to exploit it for financial gain.
Yeah, he's pure like that. Yeah. No, I feel the same way, and it's hugely exciting, and I'm addicted to the news as well. I actually had a wedding that I went to a few weeks ago where and it was right after the UK general election, like right after it, to the point where with on very little sleep, I basically had to get out to rural Herefordshire. And but what almost made that easier was that I lost my phone the night of the election, like when I was going to and fro in London, like kind of celebrating and stuff. And it was kind of a blessing. Because, yeah. I should say with the help of my very helpful partner, I was able to at least get to Herefordshire and all that sort of stuff. And then I was basically in the middle of the field for a few days. So I probably wouldn't have had the reception anyway. So I could switch off a bit more, and just kind of enjoy the company. That was a blessing in disguise, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just... I've tried to make a point of an evening to leave my mobile phone in the other room to the one I'm sitting in. And if I really need to go and check something, if I'm curious about something that's just happened in the episode of Frasier that I'm watching, okay, I will stand up and I will walk over to it. But to sit there blindly scrolling, he said, sounding like a Gen X guru, is absolutely no good for you. And it takes you out of that moment, which is something that you were lucky enough to be able to really experience with people around you. You're engaging with them and your brain isn't going phone. Nice to see your phone.
Yeah, no, it's a healthy way to live. I'd like to be able to stick to that, or at least give it a go. I'm glad you mentioned Frasier actually briefly, because I meant to tell you. I should say James was last on the podcast not crazily long ago, just earlier this year as we record, with our mutual friend Kit Power, and we were lucky enough to get to chat at length about the film The Long Good Friday, which I really, really enjoyed. And you messaged me sort of in the long tail of that, basically. You messaged me saying that you'd been rewatching a Frasier recently with Bob Hoskins as a guest on it, and I have seen I think probably all of Frasier, at least at some point. There's probably episodes I've only seen once, especially later on in it and stuff, but I've seen a lot of it several times and like a lot of it. And I have no memory at all of the Bob Hoskins episode. That's quite late on, you were saying?
Extremely late on. These are the ones where clearly the original writing team had moved on. It was moving from the genuinely fairly quite sophisticated humour of those early seasons into something that was a lot broader, a lot more in line with something like Will and Grace. But there were still lovely conceptual things that they did. In fact, they seemed to get more conceptual and have stranger episodes as they were getting towards their dying days as a show. And in that one, the conceit of it is that Frasier is dating a female gym teacher. And he sees her dressing down a child at work, and then from that point on he can only see that beautiful woman who he's dating and is having a wonderful time with in the guise of his gym teacher, as played with his Chicago accent, Bob Hoskins. So most of the show has Frasier laying shirtless in bed next to Bob Hoskins, puffing on a cigar as he asks, "How you doing, honey? What's wrong?" or giving him neck massages. It's a fantastic piece of television.
This is ringing a tiny bit of a bell now. That's it sounds like an episode that could only be improved by one of Daphne's bizarrely accented brothers walking in.
Hello there, I'm from Manchester, as you can tell.
Yeah. As someone with a knowledge of UK regional differences, you must find great, should we call it pleasure in those episodes?
Yeah, no, I'll tell you what, the thing is, the most egregious is the one who plays her brother, who's quite a good actor. He was in So I Married an Ex-Murderer. He always appeared to be playing policeman, down at heel kind of grubby guys. He played Simon Moon, who got on really well with Frasier's dad. And while the accent is absolutely terrible, and it is a guttural kind of East London pub accent as her Mancunian brother, the performance I've really got no issue with. He's a good performer apart from that.
Yeah, he's kind of an amusing character in his own right, isn't it? If you can just take him with a pinch of salt and sort of, let it be the kind of boulderization of British accent that it is. I mean, it's funny. I'm sure I've talked about this on the podcast before, but being from Manchester and sort of accepting Daphne as a character in general is a very strange leap you have to take quite early on in your life. Did you know? Again, must have mentioned this before, but did you know that John Mahoney, the actor who plays Frasier's dad, the deceased actor now, sadly, who played Frasier's dad, spent his very early years in Manchester?
I did know that, and it's interesting when there's occasions where he mocks her accent back at her, doing a bad American version of Manchester. Now, he was a good actor. I really liked him playing that Faulkner swap in Barton Fink. John Mahoney was great.
I was going to ask if you'd watch Barton Fink. Yeah, that's one of my constant pleasures, and I always forget when I watch Barton Fink, which is every few years or something, that he's only in about 2 scenes, or I think he's like yelling off stage in another scene or something. But that's he makes such an indelible impression. He's brilliant.
You'd think the way you remember that film that it was the John Mahoney show. You really would, and there was a guy at a typewriter occasionally.
Yeah, it's just the way when he turns to... Well, there's many great lines in it, but when they're at the urinals together and he just turns to John Turturro and goes, "You are dripping, son." Which is great. But yeah, it's funny you talk about a sitcom in its later years becoming broader and going from the relatively sophisticated humour of its early years into something else.
Almost, David. I think you almost pulled that off, but it was the word sophisticated that killed that segue.
You might have a point there. We are, of course, here to talk in the main about Red Dwarf, and specifically, especially as the podcast enters its later phase, Red Dwarf Series 7, which aired in early 1997 in the UK originally. And I want to talk to James about that series specifically because I think it's an interesting one, and there's loads to talk about in it, and it's a real mixed bag. But I wanted to talk to him a little bit before just about Red Dwarf in general and kind of maybe the role it's played in his life. And I should say there's at least one prior podcast that you've been on before, James, that I'll be linking to in the show notes. And I think that one, obviously you can point me in the direction of any others, but the one that I did locate was an episode you did, a bonus episode of I Don't Speak German.
Oh, yes.
A couple of years ago. I think you maybe did it even longer ago than that, but they released it sort of to the public a couple of years ago. And that's you guys talking kind of, again, a bit generally about Red Dwarf, but I think specifically about the books, the first 2 books particularly.
Yes.
And the sort of, the expanded, came after the show, but, the kind of book version of that, which is similar to our previous chats about Hitchhikers, obviously goes alongside the other media forms of it. But obviously, in Red Dwarf's case, the show is, the best known form of it, the canonical form, if you like. So I'll definitely be linking to that. I know that years and years and years ago, mid-2010s, you were also on at least one episode of the now defunct podcast Oi Spaceman, which I greatly enjoyed.
Super show.
Wonderful show, yeah, fondly remembered by a lot of people, I'm sure. But I'll link to at least the I Don't Speak German episode in the show notes. James, what does Red Dwarf mean to you, and how did you come to it originally?
The answer, respectively, is too much and too early. So Red Dwarf feels like it was omnipresent growing up. One of my earliest TV watching memories, which just means one of my earliest memories, was the episode Kryten, where the skeletons are on the ship that have died of old age, and Kryten didn't notice, and he'd been continuing to clean up after them and make them soups that went uneaten. The skeleton falling hilariously forward and landing in the soup was a horror flicker on my tiny child brain. That's the first ever memory I have of Red Dwarf. It was shown at my auntie Lizzie's house, actually, in Camberwell, is where she lived at the time. And the next time I encountered it, one of the great kind of joys of my childhood was always going to the video shop. Apollo in West Norwood was the main one, but there was Blockbusters, and there was also the really exciting video library that, to me as a child, felt like it was the size of one of these rental places that one of my dad's mates had. And my dad liked Red Dwarf. He is a big fan of British comedy, The Young Ones, Bottom, that kind of thing. Monty Python's Holy Grail is one of his big movies, as I think it is for more or less every dad in the world by law. And so he's like, "You'd like this? Put this on. You'll enjoy it. We'll have a good laugh with it." And fortunately, my dad and his mate fell out, so we got to keep those 3 tapes. The first of them, the earliest, was the last 3 episodes of Series 1, which were something like Confidence and Paranoia, The End, and Me Too. In fact, that's exactly what they were, now that I think of the back of that video case. And there was also the last first three episodes of Series 6, which included Gunmen of the Apocalypse, which is the kind of episode that will allow you to become obsessed with the show. One of their absolute shining hours in terms of writing and performance. But yeah, I lived with those for a number of years and just continued to expand my collection. If we went to WH Smith's or some kind of video shop like MVC was a place that did Only Fools and Horses tapes and Red Dwarf tapes for a long time, I was able to start building that collection up. And they were only 90-minute tapes. As I say, there were 3 episodes. The BBC were milking this particular cash cow as hard as they could, as they did with a lot of their releases. And so yeah, I just went on with it. And then the novel, as you know, I discussed in the I Don't Speak German episode, was huge for me as well. I remember reading that in primary school again and again. I think it may have already have gotten a little bit, beaten up by the time I was in primary school, because I remember thinking about the creases at that young age when we brought it in to talk about something, and that's how much I had already read it then. So there are parts of that which just live in my head like a Shakespearean actor can call upon a Hamlet speech if he was so inclined. So when you watch something that much as a child with anything, you're not aware of how much of a mark it's leaving on you, of how much you are being influenced by its philosophy, by how characters kind of become role models. And I've spoken about this more than once, probably even on our Hitchhikers episode, where you return to this stuff and you think, oh shit, look at how much of this is still in me. Look at this is incredible. And it's sometimes embarrassing to watch something that you used to idolise as a kid with a partner or a friend who knows you very well, and they say something that you yourself have said out loud in the exact same phrase, and you're not even aware that's where that came from. So Red Dwarf is all of that, and I continue to have, with some kind of critical eye, an incredible amount of affection for Red Dwarf Series 1 to 6. I think that I was always drawn to the character of Lister as a guy with a lot of potential who had these good leadership qualities, and whatever else was wrong with him, he had a hell of a lot of integrity, and that was a big influence on me. It really, really was. And as I've gotten older, I've also developed a taste for both curry and lagers as well. So what more can you say there?
And the guitar.
Yeah, absolutely true. So yeah, Red Dwarf is all that, and then we get to Red Dwarf VII, and I remember the first time I saw Red Dwarf VII. It was on BBC in 1997, but I would have been about 6 to 7 years old then. No, I would have been coming up to 8 years old. It was on after my bedtime, the new series. So I received this bounty of, I think it was 3 tapes. Yes, it was 3 tapes in total, 3 cassettes, and they were all wrapped up together. I was like, oh my god, look at all this new Red Dwarf I've never seen before. It was massive for me. And on that same day, I got the typewriter that I'd been asking for, like the freak child that I was. So I remember them sitting on my desk, a typewriter that was already completely moribund and defunct, but as an 8-year-old, I was like, yes, that's the sort of thing that a writer uses. None of your word processor nonsense. Let me click clack all night long and annoy the neighbours. And these new bits of Red Dwarf, and I put it in, and I had some friends over as a birthday party, and we enjoyed it. Of course, the first episode was about shooting an American president that I had no idea about. It was all completely new to me, and I just accepted it as new Red Dwarf. Great, this can go in the pile with the rest to be revisited as and when we need to. And it was, I watched it lots of times, but yeah, having a critical eye now, you can see the extraordinary step down in both intention, quality and execution that happens between Series 6 and Series 7. And you really do have to attribute the majority of that to the fact that 50% of the partnership went off, and it was continued under the same name with the other 50% of the partnership.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely, and we'll get into that a little bit more, and that'll require me to mentally remove Doug from Naylor in a way that I always have to do consciously and think about that, which way around that goes again. But yeah, it's funny you mentioned the quality, because there's one big thing that was instantly noticeable about Series 7 when you got to it, wasn't it? I think I myself was 11. I was having to fact check this as well, but when it came out in early 1997, was that if you'd watched any of those earlier series, you know, and they themselves to an adult eye with a lot more distance between us and them now also vary wildly, don't they? You know, Series 1 and 2 look very differently to Series 6. You were saying you had videos available of both of those very early on, and I bet they looked a bit more similar then than they do now, you know, but obviously with years between them and Red Dwarf getting, you know, as big and mainstream as it ever got, basically towards the end of sort of Series 6, at least in that initial run, there's a marked sort of at least quality difference in terms of, you know, the videotaped studio recordings, isn't there?
There is definitely, and it is noticeable. And apart from anything else, this is a show that absolutely abhors the idea of a canon or of a consistent designed thread. Things are changed between series, and if you've got the type of brain that likes to rationalise this stuff in story, it does help that this is a place where there are parallel universes, so you can just go, okay, we're in another parallel universe for this here, for this particular season. This is why the uniforms have changed, this is why the sets look different. You can't come to this looking for any sort of consistency, and the production team really hate being challenged on that. There's an interview on the documentary that came with the Series 7 DVD where I think it was Ed Bye went to a Red Dwarf convention and someone gave him some continuity shit about the time gun, and he was like, oh, that's ruined my entire time. And yeah, there's not an expectation this is ever going to be taken seriously as a coherent whole. It was just, let's slam it out on the cheap on whatever night it was broadcast, and yeah, becoming a cult classic and picking up a rabid genre fan base, which is different in some ways to other fan bases, although all fan bases have kind of become the way genre fan bases used to behave. I think particularly because now they're able to communicate across the internet, that's changed the way people interact with their media. It just means that everything's put under a microscope, and the production team clearly weren't down for that from the off.
Yeah, and I'm sure there was a lot of early internet stuff. I mean, like, you know, even earlier than you and I would have experienced it, kind of early internet stuff about Red Dwarf as well. You know, a lot of chat rooms, a lot of LAN parties, that kind of thing that I've read about in the history books. And I think that's the nature of Red Dwarf as a product as well, because it is such a strange, and we'll talk more about this in terms of Series 7 as well, specifically where it got to by then, but even the first 6 series, it is a strange blend of sci-fi and comedy and drama and sci-fi and drama and all that sort of stuff. And it's the sort of stuff that lends itself to a sci-fi fan base and a rabid sort of, you know, geeky sci-fi fan base when that was still quite a niche proposition. And it certainly coloured, you know, I myself borrowed videotapes off like family friends and things like that, and it was clear that they were kind of, you know, I guess they seemed impossibly adult then, but maybe like older family friends who had like, you know, sons who were there in their late teens, 20s, that kind of thing, you know, the kind of guys you'd expect to have all the Star Trek VHSs as well, and maybe just getting into Stargate and things like that. And maybe that's exactly the sort of people who the creators should have known would start coming at them with continuity questions and all that sort of stuff, you know.
Yeah.
You know, however ill-prepared they were for it and however resentful they were. Because, I mean, you know, again, you say we've talked about Hitchhikers, you know, and Pratchett as well. Obviously, these are strands of British comedy, fantasy, sci-fi, you know, DNA, essentially, like, coming out of the late 70s. And Dwarf is kind of, I guess, almost like, of these three, at least the last plank of that to fall into place, and heavily influenced particularly by Hitchhikers and Adams, as well as some other influences, like, you know, mentioned up front, Dark Star and things like that. But I think, yeah, it's such a strange beast. But it was, and I think it had this strange place for a boy in the 90s, because, as I say, a bit older than you, but not much more. And in the mid-90s, when Series 6 was the most recent one, it was this kind of, it felt a little bit like, I think predominantly, I'm sure there were many female fans of Red Dwarf, but it felt a bit like a boys' club. And some of that is the subject matter, of course, is that it's, you could say the sitcom is, you know, a boys' treehouse in space in some ways. You know, these are, in some respects, artificially juvenile characters, or sort of extendedly juvenile characters. They seem like relatable, maybe in the same way that characters like from The Young Ones and Bottom do in some ways. They seem like children in some respects, don't they, amongst the other sitcom archetypes they fulfill. They're like companions when you're a kid that you can relate to.
Yeah, and that's one of the pleasures of those early seasons of Red Dwarf, and one of the ones that give me the most comfort is when they're just bumming around on the ship, not getting up to particularly much. that's a nice place to spend time. It's as if you are in a treehouse with some of your friends and they're acting up and they're arguing around with each other and bickering. It was originally sold to the BBC with the elevator pitch of Steptoe and Son in space, and that would change. It evolved into this sci-fi with a lot of big ideas, and the comedy became less important. And I think it's difficult to tell again because I've seen these shows so many times. I knew exactly what was going to happen before I understood what the joke was. I knew the music of the show before necessarily the meaning had sunk in. But I do think that the comedy had grown less sharp as well, even over probably series 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. I think that's likely the case having looked at them again as an adult.
Well, having seen a lot more of it now, and kind of especially seen a lot more of the early stuff, because I was a bit slower to come to the early stuff just because of the videotapes that we did borrow and stuff like that. And me and my brother, I think in retrospect, had seen a lot more of Series 4 onwards, which might interestingly colour our perspectives on Series 7, actually, because it had become a bit of a different show in some respects. But I think the more cartoonish feel, I mean, obviously there's some very silly stuff early on in the show as well, but, you know, the more cartoonish, silly stuff, but maybe particularly the stuff around Kryten, or just what the Kryten character does for maybe particularly a young audience in the show, because he's kind of a fan favourite, and you could actually link that interestingly to the way that Data is a fan favourite in Star Trek, maybe perhaps for kids watching it especially. They are the naive, innocent in some ways android characters. They're also arguably a maternal character in other ways, which you could read quite a lot into, couldn't you, if you're watching a show like that? You know, you've got the lads, but you've also got the person looking after them, essentially, and that comes up quite heavily in Series 7 as well. But it's interesting the sort of people you latch onto. I remember an episode, I think it's in Series 3 or 4, but it's the one where Kryten's warranty's running out, and there's a killer android replacement coming for him, basically. And it's the one with the quite charming kind of extended scene where the guys take Kryten for one last, or like first party, essentially, and they have this like very kind of sweet but like geared towards adults. You know, it's meant to remind adults of drinking parties they've had, you know, maybe particularly like male get-togethers and things like that, you know, where they all get emotional and cry and talk about their families and laugh at each other and, you know, get drunk and wake up in the morning hungover. But even as a kid, I remember, you know, when the worst I'd ever woke up hungover from was too much Diet Coke the night before, you know, that being such a relatable feeling of friendship. You know, it's kind of like a glimpse ahead into adult friendship paradigms that you're presumably going to enjoy, you know, in the future.
It is, and that's the key, is that this is a show about two people who are friends who should not be spending any time together. Lister and Rimmer as the heart of this show, about their differences and about the way that Rimmer is exactly the guy who's going to drive Lister insane, and how they have to make that work and build towards a kind of grudging respect and affection, which also happened off screen as well. This is kind of the story of Craig Charles and Chris Barry, from what they tell us. It means that when it comes to a time where the show is going to continue with half of that heart gone, if Chris Barry is going to leave and Rimmer's not going to be a regular in the show anymore, if you're changing the dynamic on that ship, then it really unsettles the heart of what the show had previously been.
No, it definitely does, and I think you were talking about early characters that you find influencing in Red Dwarf, and, you know, I think you know, partly just because he's positioned as the protagonist and, you know, the quote unquote last man, you know, last human. I think Lister's the sort of natural one to find in that in Red Dwarf, but I think you know, in the same way that people in recent decades have talked about Mark and Jez from Peep Show, British sitcom fans have talked about Mark and Jez from Peep Show, and maybe either just talked about how awful they are in general, but sometimes we've given a bit more sympathy, have said, like, you know, are you more a Mark or are you a Jez? That's a sort of classic comedy fan thing to ask about Peep Show, and, you know, that if you have any sort of self-perception at all, the usual true answer is like, oh, I'm Mark sometimes and Jez sometimes else, you know.
Yeah.
My worst traits are in both of them, essentially, and I think I see quite a lot of that at an earlier age with Lister and Rimmer, you know.
It is, yeah. There's a Rimmer inside all of us, just this neurotic, unhappy, uncomfortable person who takes some kind of refuge in the way he thinks things should be done. And yeah, there's always, I think there was that episode where they started walking around the planet that had shaped itself around Rimmer's psyche, and the main thing, the overriding monster, was self-loathing, and that's what Rimmer represents, and that's kind of where the show can have him as a representation of you there. Whereas with Jez and Mark, they do kind of just make one guy. Whereas I think Confidence and Paranoia, the season 1 episode, it's really instructive. The fact that the dynamic between Lister's confidence and his paranoia is kind of just what him and Rimmer were like as well. It is just these two sides of a human being who don't completely make sense as individuals.
Well, you could argue as well that Lister and Rimmer are kind of like Mark and Jez, but if they were actually nice as well, or at least were nice for about 50% of the time, because even Rimmer isn't as sort of nasty and psychopathic, or at least often before the show gets curdled a little bit more into caricature as Mark can be in a more realistic setting, and he has flashes of that, and Lister, as you've sort of hinted before, is a nice person for the most part. He's a slob and he can be self-centered, and I mean, you could argue that it's quite rational to be self-centered if you're the last, quote unquote real person in the world, but he has his faults, obviously. And you could say some of them are moral failings, but he's basically quite a compassionate person, quite a thoughtful person.
I think as well, the character makes sense when a lot of that comes from immaturity, of him being a very young man, in his mid-20s up to his early 30s, and that's another issue with Red Dwarf continuing and not having that character evolve any, because there's these definite chimes of a self-improvement being part of Lister, but because it's a sitcom and you have to reset and go back to the same kind of feeds for lines and jokes that the audience are expecting, it means that there's no real character evolution, so he is perpetually 25, which is, to a certain extent, if you've got that much isolation, you've got an odd crew of people around you, that is going to happen. You're not going to progress as much as you might have done otherwise, but it does mean that he becomes a less appealing character, because those things that he really should have grown out of by the time that he's in his 60s, or however old Craig Charles actually is and making Red Dwarf now, are still there.
Yeah, I mean, they've become kind of the lovable kind of school peer guys when you're growing up in the 90s, maybe going into sort of charming elderly uncles, maybe, as the show goes on a little bit, into now being the guys down the pub that you probably don't want to talk to for too long, basically.
God, no.
Like in some ways, like in the kind of, I mean, we're not here to talk about the kind of post, not even post Series 8, but like post Series 7 stuff, like Back to Earth and the sort of Dave series recently, which I have glimpsed bits of, and I was actually reading up particularly about Back to Earth, actually, because I'd just forgotten how insane that was apart from anything else. I was reading up about that before we chatted tonight, and remembering what that was like, but I think maybe that is an edge to it, because it's sometimes a melancholy and bittersweet experience, and maybe slightly embarrassing sometimes to see sitcom reunions in general and sitcom continuations, and part of that is just the mortality of it. People get older, people look less like the sort of templates that you want them to look like, which is unavoidable unless you don't do it, which is a good idea.
Which is a possibility always, yeah.
Always a possibility, but I think some of it might be that kind of isolation and the fact that for these characters to be realistic in a sense they shouldn't develop, or because Red Dwarf, with a few twists and turns, has basically left them alone in space. That's kind of like, that's the status quo of Red Dwarf, and kind of still the status quo of Red Dwarf. And actually we'll talk about the ways in which Series 7 at least slightly tries to bend that arc a bit. But maybe that is something that's started to feel a little bit seedy about it, shall we say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great word choice for it, actually. And this here is maybe... No, I think... The end of Series 8 is about as long as these guys still being in their original templates, is about as long as it really makes sense.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I kind of, before we go, because I think we'll take a short break just for more water in a minute, because it's that time of year when you need more water. But I just want to, I'm aware that we've talked a tiny bit about Kryten, and we'll talk loads more about Kryten in a minute, but we talked about Lister, we talked about Rimmer a little bit, and again, more on that to come, but just shows we hadn't really talked about the cat yet at all. And I think the cat's one of those characters, and you could say in some ways he's a semi-character in a way, but it's just such an entertaining performance, and Danny John Jules is so charismatic. I mean, I was wondering if you maybe thought that, or like me, that maybe never has so little a character being carried by so much of the performance element.
I completely agree. Yeah, Danny John Jules is a once in a generation comedic talent, and it's insane how little he's given to do. He does it so well. It's there in the early ones, it's there from the moment he walks onto the screen. He is just the most watchable person in any room that he's in, and he amongst the rest of the cast individually has maintained that level of performance, that level of charisma down the 30 odd years that this stuff's been going on as well. When I've seen the most recent bit of Red Dwarf that I've seen, it's like, yep, that's the cat. I don't know about anyone else, but there's the cat. He is still being that character. There's never any depth to the cat, which again is part of the joke and part of the point. He is supposed to just be shallow, just sleepy, just a guy who is a cat. What would a cat be like? It would be like this. But there is definitely times where Danny John Jules is given an essentially unreadable line that goes 7 ways round the houses in that kind of Red Dwarf way, mentioning obscure 1990s references, comparing it to something else, and he absolutely nails it every time. He really does.
Yeah, I noticed some of those unreadable lines in Series 7, actually, even just rewatching last night. I think the question of... So, I mean, we're probably not here to critique the real... I don't know how you even describe it. The realism, the believability of the kind of internal logic of the Red Dwarf universe, but how much the cat's meant to know about Earth, and specifically, like, 21st century Earth references and things, is doesn't really work, does it, unless you squint with your entire body.
The in-novel explanation is that he, as a young cat, would just watch old sitcoms and cartoons and things. So I think there's a little bit of in-universe explanation, but honestly, of course, if there is a plausibility to this, then the cat, far from being a bit of a dippy character who has difficulty following what's going on because he's so self-interested, he is in fact one of the greatest scholars of 20th century history to ever live.
That would actually be great if they developed that as the show went on. He was just this absolute Wikipedia of like Earth references, to the point where like Lister and Roman had actually forgotten most of it, and he was just able to like cite things at length and everything. That would actually be quite a good surreal little twist,
Yeah.
Yeah, but
underused. He is all completely underused and underutilized all throughout this show.
Yeah, I remember being vaguely, this is like really early when I was still getting to know the show, even on a surface level. But I remember being like vaguely scared of the cat as a look because he's got the fangs, and I remember that being particularly emphasised. That it's angels and demons, isn't it, or demons and angels, whichever way around that goes. Where you see the the evil versions of them and the sort of exaggerated. It's almost like a werecat, isn't he? In the other universe, he's like eating like slabs of raw meat, and he's got like fangs that are 4 times the size and stuff, and it's like pretty terrifying actually when you've not even seen like American Werewolf yet or anything,
Well, that's just an odd episode in general. I think they had a director who never worked for them again, and it's just got a really strange, as you say, creepy feel throughout it. Those scenes just aren't funny. They just get under your skin a little bit. It's as if we've stepped into Clive Barker's Red Dwarf for a moment on those.
Well, yeah, and the feeding him the tarantula and even just the rotten strawberries at the start of that I found like genuinely repulsive, and it's kind of, I think that probably that was a bit like an early horror movie preview for me, I think, actually, in some respects.
Yeah, it was, and there's a couple of moments that have happened in Red Dwarf that are genuinely affecting and remain so, and I think I'm still a bit creeped out and unsettled by Demons and Angels.
Yeah, definitely. I was just forgetting to say that during lockdown, because me and Olivia had started living together, one of the things we did when we started sharing a flat together was we actually watched all of series 1 to 6 of Red Dwarf, because she's a very patient woman.
It's important that you see this. It's important to me that you watch this and know what it is.
Kind of. I think we sort of fell into it. It wasn't like it wasn't like something I'd always planned to do with her. I think I maybe watched a couple of early episodes and she actually started watching along, and it just kind of happened organically. But I think it was actually, I just remembered we did that, and it was probably via Netflix, and then we got up to Tika to Ride. We got up to series 7, and they had that mad extended laugh trackless version of Tika to Ride on Netflix and no other version.
God, yeah.
And we started watching that, and I was like, I watched about 10 minutes of it with her. I was like, I can't do this. This is insane. I guess we could skip it, but
There were 3 of them. There was Tika to Ride, there was Blue, and there was Dutch Soup. They extended them, they put more in, they did extended special effects shots, and they released them all on a single videotape. I remember getting that and being delighted that there was more Red Dwarf.
Yeah. That's we'll talk about it a little bit, but that's bizarre watching them without the laugh track. It's one of the strangest bits of television, watching anything like that, particularly shot on film and everything.
So she must have been able to tolerate them if you made it up to series 6.
Yeah, no, I think she had a good time with them, and she was, we were doing Kryten impressions, going smee, he together, going slightly insane during the later stages of lockdown and things like that. It's all the good stuff. Well, I guess we've had enough of a sort of intro here, but we'll talk now a little bit more about Series 7, and before that, we'll just take a short break. See you all in a bit.
See you soon.
Wiped out? Kryten, man, they can't be.
I'm afraid so, sir. The laser cannon breached the main water tank and flooded supply deck B. They didn't stand a chance.
Yeah, but surely...
There was nothing we could do to save them, sir.
So you mean... now we've got no poppadoms at all?
No poppadoms, no curries. All the Indian food supplies have been totaled.
I'll have to survive without them, then. I'll have salads.
Sir, you're in shock. You don't know what you're saying.
After all, it's only curry.
Only curry. The enormity of it hasn't sunk in. You must mourn, sir. Don't you see? You must mourn.
Curries?
Oh, sir. Get it out. Cry like a baby.
What am I going to do? Curry night was the one little beacon I had. It made me feel like a normal, ordinary guy. Not some sad freak stuck in deep space. No woman, no hope, no curry.
And worse still, a choice of only 2 alcoholic beverages. Cinzano Bianco or Advoca. It's a human tragedy.
No lager.
Sir, there is nothing unmanly in howling like a hungry prairie dog.
No lager.
All the supplies on B deck were destroyed, sir. There wasn't even any wreckage. No debris. Zip.
God. A few beers and a curry. It was the highlight of my week.
I used to look forward to curry night too, sir. Seeing your little face all happy and smiling. Come rain or shine, we'd always make time for curry night. Every Friday.
Saturday,
Sunday.
Tuesday,
Wednesday.
Thursday. Always the same meal. 3 poppadoms with mango chutney.
Those little onions.
Dill pickle.
That day-glow green mint sauce that just doesn't wash out.
And that weird red stuff that no one knows what it is.
Then a shami kebab starter.
Followed by a chicken vindaloo, kamikaze hot, with a fire extinguisher on standby.
And 2 scoops of kulfi ice cream.
And 2 indigestion tablets. Oh, life without curry. It's like Laurel without Hardy. The Lone Ranger without that Indian bloke.
Sir, perhaps you could learn to love pasta.
Pasta? You sick?
So welcome back, and me and James are back to talk about, a bit more specifically about Red Dwarf Series 7, because we've been sort of dancing around it a little bit, dancing right up to the threshold and then backing off for understandable reasons. But Series 7, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, was the series of Red Dwarf, which was a bit of a comeback for the show, because I think there was something like a 5-year gap, James, between 6 and 7?
That's about right, yeah. So Series 6 went out in 1993, and this was early 97. So that was the longest time it had been. Up until that point, it had been a consistently once every 2 years or so from 1998, which was when the first series was broadcast. So, yeah, it was the longest time it had been since Red Dwarf had been on. I'm sure there was a lot of panicked anguish on the burgeoning internet. I'm sure, there was probably some point when Red Dwarf was one of the largest things on the internet, just full stop, just because of the nature of fandom. And that gap in between 6 and 7 probably would have had people thinking, oh no, is this another Doctor Who? It will be now just not going to see any more of this ever again, without it ever really officially being cancelled or going away. And this coming back, it was a huge deal for people, and the bigger budget was obviously completely on display. They had started filming it in a different way. It looked like 90s TV in a really big way, a way it hadn't previously. If you kind of separate 1995 as the obvious dividing line in the middle of that decade, you can just completely see what late 90s looked like with this. It almost looks like an episode of Buffy in the way that it's shot.
Yeah, no, it's getting into that, and what we now sort of, with slightly more sort of general TV media literacy, tend to quite casually call single camera. That tends to prevail in Series 7, and there's obviously quite a bit of location filming, still a lot of studio stuff, but I think I read up that even the studio stuff is is laugh tracked after the event, so they're not actually doing it in front of live audiences in the way that I think almost all of the at least studio bound series 1 to 6 are, which is a very different feel.
And it'll change the performances as well, and it does. They don't have the audience to bounce off of, and the laugh track was added on in a cinema. They screened it and they recorded the sound. So people had every right to be excited going into this for those reasons, for the big budget and so forth. Obviously, there would have been consternation about Rob Grant leaving the duo, but you go into this, there's some other writing partnerships going on. There's a reason to have high hopes. And then you come into this truly bizarre episode about the Kennedy assassination that's kind of unlike what the show had ever done before. And everyone's just a little bit off. I really and immediately feel Rob Grant's absence in this. I don't know about you, but I've read both of their solo Red Dwarf novels, and I much prefer Backwards by Rob Grant versus Last Human by Doug Naylor. That feels like Red Dwarf to me in a way that Naylor Dwarf simply doesn't.
I don't remember enough about those later books to judge, but I'm sure I noticed a tone difference at the time, but to see what the specifics were would be interesting. And I think I knew about this split slightly at the time, because this is for the very, as I say, as an 11-year-old, but one who was reading sci-fi magazines occasionally and things like that. This is probably the start of me being a bit more of a TV nerd in terms of knowing some of these production details. A lot of that came through Star Trek fandom, of course. I should say, actually, I was going to, we were talking about other stuff. You were starting to talk about it looking like 90s TV, and brought up the spectre, I guess at this point, the sort of looming spectre of Buffy. In terms of like sci-fi and British TV comedy, you've got two different worlds there. But in sci-fi terms, when Red Dwarf Series 7 comes on, you are after Star Trek: The Next Generation, but Deep Space Nine's still in full flow. Voyager's started. You've got the Stargate franchise on television. You've got all that sort of stuff. I actually listened to one of your podcasts recently, James, and you'll obviously get to plug that at the end. But I heard your podcast partner Kevin talking about Sliders. I looked that up. Hello, Kevin, by the way, if you're listening. I looked that up. That 95 to 2000, I think. So we're in full flow of that as well. The Sliders golden age.
First time those words have ever been used in conjunction with one another.
I'm sorry, Kevin. I don't mean that sarcastically. I've never particularly watched Sliders, but that's no judgment. I just never really got into it. And you are talking about the X-Files as well. Obviously, is on TV, and Buffy's just around the corner. So things are changing. In British sitcom terms, you're well into men behaving badly. Things like One Foot in the Grave that we've talked before on the show about is still on the air. TV sketch comedy terms, you've got things like The Fast Show, maybe Tail End of Harry Enfield, still popular in British culture. It's debatable whether we could call it a golden age or not, but there's stuff going on and stuff that we'll be very familiar with growing up with it, and stuff that was the contemporaries of Red Dwarf in both sci-fi and comedy terms. So Series 7 is an odd beast because it is sort of trying to do something that is even more a hybrid of sci-fi and comedy than before, but leaning on the drama and leaning on the sci-fi conceits that had always been mixed into Red Dwarf, but maybe a little bit more heavily or centrally, would you say?
Definitely, yeah. I think that there is a lot less focus now. And it had been a natural evolution, but here there is a real move away from that steptoe and son. As much as that was always in the DNA, it's really now putting these guys into a crisis of the week situation. They're not monsters of the week necessarily, but sometimes they can just turn into monsters of the week as well. And I think that the sci-fi concepts, they not only are an adventure to go through now in Series 7, they start kind of pitting into long-lasting canon that's going to continue to define how the show moves forward, and also changes how things were in the past. For example, making Lister his own father and Kochanski his mum. That's not something I think that earlier Red Dwarf would have done there, but it does it, and it does kind of grapple with the strange emotional feelings that would have burst up, though it's not necessarily explained too clearly as to why this is all going on, but it's actually quite a satisfying episode for all that.
It probably shows how much the sort of fandom culture changed around it, and fandom literacy, you might say, changed around it, doesn't it? It may be in the middle of a Star Trek revival, apart from anything else, where a show that even it hadn't been shy about it. It previously relied on things like basic knowledge of parallel universe tropes and things like that. That's now relying almost as casually on knowledge of paradoxes, and there's both Tika to Ride and Ouroboros use that. I mean, Ouroboros it's more tacked on, you could say, even though it's more character based, but Tika to Ride. Well, yeah, I actually deflected to you a bit when you started talking about Tika to Ride, but maybe we should talk a bit more about your impressions of that as a boy and now, because apart from anything else, it's almost good to talk about in isolation, because after that, the status quo, the sort of centre of the show, I mean, the aesthetics already changed, but the actual character centre of the show changes after that. So maybe Tika to Ride is good to talk about as almost like a last hurrah, like a sort of last traditional Red Dwarf adventure in some ways.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, my initial perceptions of it is like, wow, this is great. This is, first of all, as I've said, new Red Dwarf. Let's just be delighted by that. But also, it felt like it was epic. It was larger. There were more moving parts. There was more things going on. And I don't think any of the 8-year-old boys who stay around my house to watch videos with me would have mocked any previous series of Red Dwarf or anything that I chose to put on. But I think that there was a kind of sitting up and paying attention that this is something of value. This is interesting. To come to it now, from the opening moments of cameras exploding because the story is too convoluted, as Lister handily ties up the paradox that was at the end of the previous episode from 4 years previously, it's immediately clear that we're dealing with a different level of reality, and that there's less emotional stakes involved in the interactions going on between this crew. I don't think that Lister from a previous series would have messed around with Kryten's personality or taken out a guilt chip or anything like that. He would have considered that beyond his... he wouldn't have had the right to do something like that. And at the end of it, where they all decide to jump up on him bodily, potentially doing the character of Lister some very serious injuries and causing internal bleedings, this is where Bottom is starting to seep into the show in a way that it hadn't done previously. So it's strange in that way, because on the one hand there is a greater attention to a mise-en-scene that seems realer, that's got that single camera setup, but there's also a far more juvenile, even for this show, stretch out and lack of consideration for what these characters are and how they interact with each other.
We'll talk more about Kennedy and the role Kennedy plays in this, like not just mechanically in this story, but like the kind of what he means in this, because it's it's maybe doesn't take that long to analyse. It might be fairly basic, but I was wondering on this rewatch what you thought of the line where they're all on Earth and it's the sort of post everyone fleeing kind of crisis Earth that they've created, and they're walking along talking about Kennedy, and Rimmer just says, they're all talking about Kennedy and his legacy, and Rimmer just goes very, very seriously, he was a fine man. What is that? Like, because obviously that seems entirely in earnest as far as I could decode it as well, and obviously Rimmer is, would be an earnest character about that kind of historical figure, a flawed historical figure, particularly perhaps, but like, is the show making fun of Kennedy there? I don't think it is. Like,
No, I think it's very much the case that the show is like, let's all be serious about this now. We're all having a good laugh around Kennedy. Don't forget, he was a good fellow.
I mean, that's embarrassing, isn't it? Yeah. I don't. Sorry, I know this podcast is usually a bit more charitable than this. Maybe you just caught me on the wrong Tuesday, but like, this is that's not great, is it? on any level, to take Rimmer as like the sage word on JFK and his many political and human failings. I mean, I know they're doing this it's basically, and it's also partly for kids as well. It's like when we talk about Doctor Who, you've got to remember it's always at least partly for that. And mid-90s Red Dwarf was at least partly for kids, and that's why we're talking about it. But I don't know about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably put Kennedy's legacy and his overall impact on America probably on a par with Bill Clinton's. Can you imagine a very special episode saying of Clinton he was a fine man? I don't think that's necessarily going to happen.
Well, not now anyway.
No.
I mean, otherwise, if you had almost goes without saying that we're recording this in mid 2024, where talking about the sort of light comedy use of a presidential assassination, both failed presidential assassination as the Dwarf Boys make it, and then successful one, is an odd place to be. But obviously presidential reputations change, and I think even now for people who are sort of engaged with these sort of topics, JFK probably has a different centre of gravity to his reputation as he did in the mid-90s. But it really does seem like a sort of sincere pie into liberalism, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's a cutout from a children's history book of a representation of this man and his legacy. And I was quite taken aback when I started learning about him, because I just took all this in earnest as it was put forth. I thought he was going to be someone, because he's treated comparable to someone like Martin Luther King in terms of his wisdom and his positive impact on the world. And to get to read one of the many biographies of Kennedy and go, oh fuck, oh wow,
yeah,
no.
But isn't it weird though that in this episode, in Ticket to Ride, he is treated as that, but also at exactly the same time, and to make the episode actually conceit work, it's central to it that he was a very deeply flawed person who needs to die, otherwise people will find out about him.
Yeah, that's an interesting trick for them to be playing, isn't it? Just narratively.
Yeah, it's like he was both the saint and he definitely wasn't, and he must die. He must die by his own hand, ultimately. Spoilers, to ensure that legacy that we are being reverent about at the same time.
Crazy conclusion to an episode, by the way. If I had sat down with an adult's mind when this was first broadcast and someone was to say, how do you think the new series of Red Dwarf is going to end? Probably with a laugh, I'd imagine. I certainly don't imagine it's going to have JFK being the shooter from the grassy knoll assassinating himself. Yeah. I don't see that coming.
And fading away in a melancholy way. You know what? I've started to think that one of the reasons I didn't get too into JFK and the sort of conspiracy theories around, both the real event and the movie when I saw it a few years later, was that on one level at the back of my head, James, I think I already knew what really happened, and it was this.
Yeah, in the back and to the left of your head, you knew exactly what happened.
That's where I keep that stuff, actually. Yeah. It just tends to slosh around in that direction. But yeah, I mean, I think Ticket to Ride is extraordinary, but and it's got that kind of that aesthetic, as I say. It's trying to look glossy, it's trying to look serious. I mean, even the assassination scenes where you've got motorcades and Secret Service men are obviously in quite tight shot, and all the book depository stuff, and if you really look at it, they're trying to still keep it pretty cheap. It's like people say about Doctor Who these days, isn't it? It's more expensive than it ever has been before, and it's still pretty cheap though, really, on the scale of things. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think those scenes in the Texas Book Depository, I think they're quite well done, actually. They're some of the best of the episode, and there's a real humour to the physical comedy that happens with Oswald. I still like that part of the show. What
do you think of, and because I think this will tie into sort of Kryten in general, this series, although it's not the same idea throughout the other episodes, but there is more of sort of flawed Kryten on display. What do you think about guilt-free Kryten? Still eliciting a chuckle at this stage of your life? Or?
Robert Llewellyn is such a ham. I love that about him. I've got a lot of affection for the guy. And you see him in the interviews and he's a complete lovey and he's got his anecdotes ready to go and he's going to engage with things on a certain level of seriousness. So you can't help but enjoy the fact that Llewellyn is playing him right up there. He is going... When you compare where the character had come from with the fairly realistic isn't the right word, but there's a toned downness to the original Kryten's performance. The actor's name currently escapes me, but there is something quite theatrical and appealing about that. And then he's replaced with Llewellyn, who just worked to make his voice and his face do all of the action, all of the acting through that mad plastic mask that he wears, and it gives him the right and it gives him the opportunity to go as big as he wants to. And guilt-free Kryten, absolutely, he is chewing that scenery, and yeah, I do like it.
Well, that's quite the achievement, especially acting through that mask. Yeah, you're right, and as a Star Trek fan, obviously I have a lot of respect for people who can do that. I think my brother, who will almost certainly be listening to this, wouldn't let me go away without mentioning 3 guilt-free Kryten bits, which I'm saying this is me, 38-year-old me, standing by these bits, as well as 11-year-old me. It's when he starts smoking it's also the bit when he slings his groinal attachment over his shoulder at the same time as he's saying "You bet your ass." And one of my favourite bits in all of Red Dwarf is I'll paraphrase slightly, but it's the when he's trying to talk to Lister about the damage that's been done to the timeline, and Lister's like, "What have I done?" And he's well, you brought humanity to the brink of extinction, sir. Gum. I think to this day, me and my brother will just casually offer each other gum when the situation isn't going well. That just comes so out of nowhere. I love it.
Yeah, all three of those worked, 100%.
Yeah. I think the gum line is maybe one of my favourite lines in Series 7 to this point. But I mean, that's a tall tree in quite a low forest, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because help me out with this. Tell me what you think of the comedy of Red Dwarf, going back to where it was on season 1. Is it a funny show?
That's a big question that I wasn't quite expecting. Obviously the comedy, the emphasis of the comedy changes, and you're right in sort of highlighting that it goes from more character based, as you say, Steptoe Son in space stuff, Dark Star with a little twist in the early stuff, to broader comedy and sillier jokes, I suppose. I'm trying to think. It's a weird thing, isn't it? Because laughs, you sort of remember the shows that make you laugh, but you don't particularly remember how much you laughed at them at the time. It's hard to quantify it. I think as someone who had a healthy appetite for Star Trek and everything, I always had a lot of time for the sort of more serious sci-fi stuff, and that when it lent into that stuff, and even when it got into the technobabble and stuff, because that was just the sort of language I spoke because of Star Trek and things like that. I think I did find Kryten very funny as a younger person. I found some of the jokes that were maybe, you might say, they were more sort of Blackadder jokes, a lot of the insulting kind of tongue twisters that Rimmer and Lister throw at each other. I found them amusing. I'm not sure if it's ever consistently amusing or if that's ever its consistent job, and I think that's kind of, I'm just way too close to it, maybe like you are, to ever work out whether that's a plus or a minus against its name, really. Yeah. Does that make any sense?
It does absolutely. And as you say, there's a varying amount of how much it actually wants to be funny, and I do think that when in the earlier going, when it wants to be funny, it does it more consistently. But through every series, and I'm sure if I was to watch one from Dave now, there'd be at least one moment that would raise a chuckle, just because these actors know exactly what they're doing, and the writer knows how to write for them.
Yeah, I was sharing, slightly embarrassingly, I was sharing a sort of fan script thing that I wrote for Red Dwarf. Not for Red Dwarf in the sense that they asked me to. I would never claim that. But about 5 years ago, I think I was thinking it would be fun to try and write a sitcom script of some, or at least have a dabble in it, and I realised that probably the easiest way, or the easy way into that, would be to try and write a fan script for a sitcom where I could hear the characters' voices in my head and the actors' voices in my head. And one that occurred, or the first one that occurred, was Red Dwarf, so I wrote what turned out to be I think it's about 20 minutes if you try reading it out, sort of script, which has the characters in it, and I actually really enjoyed that as an experience. It's not something I really kept up, so I would not in any way say I'm very good at writing sitcoms a thing yet, but I would certainly recommend, if anyone wants to dabble in that kind of writing experiment, maybe start at the shallow end with taking voices well and character voices well, because if anything, you can just hear whether the jokes work. Basically, you can sort of run a Rimmer line through your head, lay it down on paper, and then read it in Chris Barry's voice if you haven't already, and go, nah, it needs something else, or it needs a tweak, or that he wouldn't say that word. And it's it makes you realise, when people writing for shows always say, well, we were just sort of writing generic characters, and then we saw the actors after season 1, and then we got into it. I totally know what they mean.
Completely. And not only the actors' performances, but the more you write, the more the characters tell you where they would need to go. There's certain things that you can force happen within your writing, but it will clang out as loudly as a bell being struck. It absolutely will. I must write something in the Red Dwarf universe. I must write a fan short story, because it's not something I don't think I've ever done, actually. I don't think I've ever written any fan fiction, and my friends who do it get an awful lot out of it as well.
Or maybe you can write 10 minutes and we'll tape that onto my 20-minute one, and we'll just have a full half hour.
Brilliant. And then, send it straight over to Dave, and we'll have that produced for Monday.
Well, I don't think I had any Holly dialogue in my original one, so maybe if you added a few Holly scenes, that'd really help me out.
I love Norman Lovett, by the way. I've been watching some of his stand-up because it was recommended to me on YouTube after I went through some of the Red Dwarf bonus features on there, and I really adore there's so much of his stand-up persona in Holly, of someone who seems to be purposely not being very good or interested at this. I think that's great.
Well, because you've mentioned it, because we don't have to talk about these episodes in order. We're not doing like a full through them in that sense. I just want to talk about some highlights or even lowlights. But when Holly turns up again in the last episode of this series and gets huge audience reaction to "All Right, Dudes," yeah. I think because I had a different relationship with the show, I don't think I knew who that was. I mean, yeah. I'd seen enough of what she called Hattie Hayridge, is it, to know that within a few lines, even before they said it, that was probably Holly. But the fact that this male figure came up on screen and was the ship's computer that seemed to meet with this huge recognition. It, again, is this thing, even when you're quite young, the context. The moment you hear the whoops, basically, and the cheers, it's someone that the audience is familiar with, so they're probably from an earlier part of the show. But I think that was my introduction to him.
Yeah. No, and I love that persona for a ship's computer as well. There's moments in those early series where he's just fucking with them for his own amusement, and that's a great character, is Holly. Well,
he's another variant on the sort of Hitchhiker's as Eddie, the shipboard computer and stuff, isn't he? He's another comedy computer who's just the wrong person you want to have around in a crisis, isn't he? For slightly different reasons than Eddie is.
Yeah.
And it actually made me think. I can't remember what the episode is later in this series. It's the Epideme episode when they're talking to the Epideme virus. Which is a great vocal performance from the actor who does that. But that's got a bit of Eddie the shipboard computer to it as well, isn't it? Just that weird, like, exaggerated twang, although it's actually got a lot more of Audrey from Little Shop of Horrors to it as well.
Yeah. No, that actor is incredible. It is such a huge voice performance, but you really believe that this is what a virus would be like. We are, of course, bouncing around here because there isn't much point in going episode by episode, but that episode that has Holly in it at the end, they are some of the best ones of this series. And I looked it up, all of the ones that I like the best, which is the two-parter that closes it out, and I think the Ace Rimmer episode were co-written with Paul Alexander, so that might have been someone who was worth adding to the team full time if it had been possible.
Yeah, it's the again, it doesn't matter if we skip around, but that two-part at the end is almost like, I wouldn't say it's a great show, but it's like where it's becoming a proper show again, isn't it? It's almost like shaking off this little experiment, and now it's this phase it's been through, and it's about to settle in and become a proper show again, which it then doesn't do, interestingly, in any other for any other stage really after that. But did you read that the I don't have the actor's name in front of me, but the Epideme voice actor is apparently a long-term friend of Danny John Jules.
Oh no, I didn't see that. No, that's cool. Danny John Jules seemed to be getting all sorts of family members and friends cast in this series, because the baby that plays Lister is, I believe, his niece or his nephew.
Oh, that's really cool. That's the sort of Sophia Coppola at the font in Godfather of this. I love that. Well, to take you back to Stoke Me a Clipper, because as I say, that's the second episode of the series, but the one where they deliberately break the status quo because Chris Barry wanted out. I've always told people that Chris Barry wanted out. Told people as if people are asking me in the street, stopping me. I've always told them, just ringing out my town crier bell, that Chris Barry is not in this series very much because he wanted to go out and do the Tomb Raider movie in Hollywood, which he's in. He's in, I think, both of those Angelina Jolie Tomb Raider movies as the butler. I actually looked up the dates of that, and the first Tomb Raider movie was only came out in 2001. And the video game only came out in 1996, so I don't think that could have been the case. But I think he was wanting to do Hollywood and stuff, wasn't he? I think he was wanting to turn himself in that direction.
You've got to remember how massive the British Empire was. That's just completely forgotten today. But it was a huge sitcom on the BBC at a time when there was only 4 channels. So Chris Barry, that name was opening doors. And also it was exhausting for him because he was in every scene and coming to Red Dwarf, and there was going to be a lot of technobabble to learn. It seemed like it was a show in decline. It was an unknown quantity. So for Chris Barry's career, going to Hollywood isn't as unlikely as it might well have been. British sitcom actors don't tend to do too well over there. It doesn't really carry, even though there's something that's flawed and kind of brilliant like Drop Dead Fred. Rich Mel never became the megastar that he should have done, to be spoken about in the same breath as Peter Sellers. But yeah, it was essentially that he was tired, and also that he had much better looking things apparently ahead of him.
Yeah, and suppose did have a brief Hollywood career, albeit a supporting one. I just looked at the British Empire on Wikipedia, and I noticed that one critic described it, apparently non-ironically, as the faulty towers of the 90s.
Now, I've stepped back to watch it. I think it was on Gold not too long ago, and the 1990s had never felt so long away. It's like people liked this. The same was true also with another one called 2.4 Children, which I loved.
I'd forgotten about that. Wow.
That was huge. That was another massive show that I thought was funny when I was staying up past my bedtime to watch it, that you go to now, and it's like, how did it even... This barely even hangs together as a television programme, let alone a comedy.
Yeah, what an age. What an age. So, yes, Don't Be a Clipper is the departure of Arnold Rimmer, or at least it's part of the aborted departure of Arnold Rimmer, and not even the last one in this series to have him in it. So I don't know how successful it can be said to be in that respect. I liked this one as a kid. I was very impressed by it because, I thought it does a cool thing with Rimmer, because it takes his character and takes it somewhat seriously, and I think Rimmer was always best when they did take him a little bit seriously. There are other bits of the show that aren't as good when they take them a little bit seriously, but I think Rimmer works better when you give him that veil of true pathos and underachievement, because as you were sort of hinting at before, like Lister's underachievement is more obvious, but Rimmer's is really the burning one behind everything he does, isn't it? I'm sort of reminded of the Nico line when she says, "Don't confront me with my failures. I have not forgotten them," and that's the entirety, the core of Rimmer's torture, isn't it? Is that he knows he is a failure. He worries about it more than Lister does overtly. But by worrying about it overtly, I guess he hides it more, and and there's all his torture wrapped into that edge. But then Ace Rimmer, who's a fan favourite, a very silly character, one of the broader characters the show has, and it's essentially Chris Barry doing a silly voice, comes back from a previous season, and he is also Rimmer's torture because he is Rimmer's potential. Yeah.
And there's a kind of nobility to this story where it comes in here. They were going to have this character leave because he had finally progressed past the kind of two dimensions that he had been trapped in. He was going to be allowed to grow and develop into a ridiculous superhero, but one that has his feet based in treating people equally and become the best version of himself. So I think there's a really nice story in here, and there's bits of action and ideas that go on that are really cool. I love the fact that we're going into the AR machine, like in Dumb and the Apocalypse, and Lister's trying to have sex with the AR machine. I think this is all good. I like the way that there's the jousting scenes. I love, to this day, it's a ridiculous opening, but the fighting with the Nazis, Indiana Jones style, it's just really well done. It's just a lot of fun, and even riding that badly made crocodile, you understand the pitch that this character is at. It's more now that we're getting these stabs of comedy that sound quite discordant because they're not part of the whole, because there's a fairly believable death scene. I think Chris Barry does a really good job playing Ace Rimmer with all of his showy bullshit removed to show a man who's actually afraid of death coming there but facing it as bravely as he possibly can do, and seeing our Rimmer start to step up to the task as well. I think he does a good job of delineating between those two characters, and if this had been where Rimmer left the show, it'd be quite a happy ending for him.
I like the idea of, again, just as an actual sci-fi conceit that you could imagine on a much more serious, consistently serious program. I like the idea that we're all, because it is, I think I've talked before, it's fun to play around with parallel universe thoughts in your own head and your own life and everything. And some of those are about your potential or just other routes that you didn't take. I mean, that's the whole thing, really, isn't it? I like the idea, just the sort of nice poetic idea. It's almost like a Michael Moorcock idea used more cheerfully, where you get replaced endlessly by versions of yourself that have reached that full potential, but then they can't do it forever. It's like a shift system,
a relay race.
Yeah, because they're just that visual. I believe fans mock it a lot at the end because the CGI, late 90s CGI is just usually not very good in general, but particularly this isn't the high grade stuff that they're using in Red Dwarf Series 7. They have that visual of the the used up light being shot into this sort of nebula of them, which you zoom out and reveal it's like a Saturn-like planet's rings, and that's it doesn't look great, but it's a neat idea.
And I think it carries the emotion at the moment, particularly the music. The story in this episode is fantastic, and I think the music just about manages to get past the Windows 97 computer screensaver. That's about the quality of this CGI.
Yeah, and it's also got, I was talking before about favourite moments in Series 7, but I mean on this rewatch I just realised it's also got one of my favourite moments of Series 7 in, because it's the bit where Ace has passed away, but they come in and our quote-unquote Rimmer is dressed like Ace, and they all think he's Ace, but Lister says it in a way. Lister says like, "You're right, Ace," you're right there, and in a way where instantly, even before the dialogue that follows that scene, that Lister knows it's not the old Ace. He's saying that to ease Rimmer into doing what he must do, I guess.
Yeah, it's a good moment, and that's again where you see the friendship between these two characters, the mutual support that they've been able to lend to one another in amongst the sniping and the genuine hatred and annoyance that they do feel for one another.
I was also thinking, because of the utility that Holly originally intended Rimmer for, to keep Lister sane, but also Rimmer's need to sort of escape this and move on. It's almost like a father letting his son go, isn't it? Like letting him go off to uni or move to the big city or something like that. It's funny you talk about steptoe and son before. I wonder if there's a version of I'd never actually thought about this before until I just started talking now, but maybe Lister is kind of Albert in a way. Rimmer is the son who's kept around because Lister actually needs him.
It's completely a family unit, with, of course, as you said, Kryten taking on the maternal role and Lister being either the paternal or the fraternal role there, and the cat's also the little brother of the gang. So, yeah, I think you really can see that dynamic start to play out. I think not only in TV shows, but I think most people tend to, in a larger group, start to drop into these sorts of roles, take on sort of caregiving or piss taking based on what's right within the dynamics of a group. I'm sure there's been some sort of psychological study that's been done on it, but you see that here in that moment where Lister just immediately starts to G him up in a very un-Albert Steptoe kind of way.
Yeah, Albert Steptoe is most generous, perhaps. Or doing it as a prank before the turn at the end of the episode. I suppose it's also just the way, because I think you guys talked, and I don't speak German more about this, but there's also just the way that Rimmer needs different sort of acclamations, or thinks he needs different acclamations than Lister does, partly because of their sort of class positionality and Rimmer's childhood hang-ups, and Lister's as well. But he kind of wants this sort of middle class validation. Rimmer wants medals. He literally wants to graduate. He wants to be an officer in a way that Lister doesn't need. Lister has his own deficiencies and perceived deficiencies and stuff, and wants to change his life, but he doesn't need or want the same things as Rimmer. So in a way, Rimmer's escape and graduation into Ace is kind of, it's still Rimmer. It's not unrealistic because it's still kind of shallow. He sort of needs to be the hero as much for his own parade as he does for good deeds.
Yeah, completely. And it's only by going to such an absurd position of heroism that he finds any kind of peace in himself. That's as high as that character needed to get to be okay with being Arnold Rimmer.
Well, can we? Because I'm very aware we've not talked about Kochanski yet, and that has to happen. So can we just very, very briefly go forward and talk briefly about Blue, because that obviously that ties off the Rimmer stuff for this series, and that for me was an undoubted comic highlight when I was a kid, because I think both me and I actually remember the entire family, my mum and dad as well as me and my little brother, watching the Rimmer ride experience, the Rimmer experience at the end of that, and replaying that bit over and over again, and actually just most of that episode really, because there's the sort of not that amusing, but there's some Rimmer flashbacks in that as well, so you're sort of returning to a bit of the old show, and you've got all the stuff about Kryten trying to snap Lister out of his despondency and everything. I guess did you have any thoughts on that on this rewatch?
It's very strange that this occurs so quickly after Rimmer's departure. I think is that episode 4, Blue?
It's actually, I've got it in front of me here, it's episode 5. Yeah.
5, yeah. So Stoke Me a Clipper was very, very recently, and they go into this well. It's as if the show simply can't let go of Chris Barry. He's got to be here, and he's in this a lot. There's various flashback scenes, there's a dream sequence, and there's of course probably pound for pound the most Rimmer you'll ever see, with those little munchkins dancing across the screen and the world from his perspective. The show knows that Rimmer is the other half of it, and Danny John Jules actually in the DVD special features says that the sadness that Lister's feeling may well be the way that Doug Naylor's writing about his own being left by himself, which is an interesting take on Blue. Also, he's in the position that Lister ends up in, which is I never want to see that lying, cheating Weasley and so forth. Maybe where that relationship ended up.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's a good touch. I don't know if your mileage might vary, and it's completely valid if it does. But I was wondering about the dream kiss that then Lister wakes up to, sort of scrubbing his mouth out. Basically, that is a classic gay panic moment in a sitcom. But I kind of let it get away with it because I also find it so charming and in a weird way tender. It's almost like his subconscious is more enlightened than he is,
I like that. I'm going to take your read on it versus my own, which is that it was gratuitous teasing of the actors, in the same way that Dermot Morgan turned to the writers of Father Ted and he said, "What are you going to do next? Cover me in shit?" And they've spent an entire season trying to work out how they should cover Ted in shit.
Yeah, no, it's maybe comparable. I mean, I suppose any sort of guy on guy kiss that elicits sort of whoops of hilarity from the studio audience and then ends with at least one of the characters showing disgust at it is not great. But I suppose it's the point he's got to where it's almost less the idea of two guys kissing in it, although that's obviously in there for the mainstream audience, and it's more the idea of these two guys kissing.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think that Lister probably wouldn't have had that reaction to a non-Rimmer man. If he dreamt about kissing the cat, he should have probably been able to make a joke about it to the cat afterwards. But
yeah, that's my headcanon as well. You're improving this bit by bit for me, James.
But yeah, there's a grossness to this, and of course it lived on past 1997, but it was strange to sit down and watch that still being a joke that lands so well with the audience within my lifetime. But of course, yeah, there's gay panic jokes all over American Pie, probably up until like American Pie 5 or what's happening. It still does appear in the mainstream, but it's very nice that a lot of this stuff has been stamped out. Yeah,
no longer reliable as a garden strimmer.
Exactly, and it will never be as popular as Yul Brynner.
Well, that wraps up Chris Barry's role in it, or at least as much as we have time for. But
I had no idea Mr. Lister was claustrophobic. Why did he never mention it?
Well, it's probably not something he feels comfortable talking about.
He's told me about everything else about his life.
Not everything, Kryten.
Absolutely, Mom.
Everything?
Before you arrived, nights were long and dull. Cheese slice snap can only entertain for so long.
So what did he tell you about me?
Oh, absolutely everything, Mom. I don't think he missed a single detail.
You mean he told you about the rusty gate?
Oh, the rusty gate. That was one of the first things he told us. Yeah, we all had a good laugh about that.
He told you that? He told you that I make it sound like a rusty gate when I'm making love? He told you that?
No, he told us his grandma once had a rusty gate and he helped fix it.
And that gave you a good laugh?
Well, like I say, Ma'am, nights were long and dull. We were glad of the anecdote.
So he didn't... Just shut up, okay? I never said that.
Allow me a second, Mom. Just cross-filing that story under B for blackmail and A for anecdote. Subcategory S for so funny you'll laugh till you're sick.
Look, which stand-head. Me and Dave, it's all in the past.
In which case, Mom, why does he keep looking at you in the same way a starving man would look at a packet of roasted peanuts?
Well, it's because...
It's because, Ma'am, he can't wait to get the wrapper off and taste the salty goodness.
Yeah, I really want to talk to you predictably about Kochanski, as played by Chloe Annette, both in terms of kind of what they meant for us at the time and kind of how it comes across in a rewatch. Because I think there's an unpacking of what they're trying to do with how well it works, without making that particularly unpleasantly about the actress in particular. But although that's fun to talk about as well. But yeah, Kochanski, female character who's a minor character in the show, slightly bigger character in the books, although I'll let people listen back to your I Don't Speak German about that. Famously played by Claire Grogan. Very, very charming Scottish actress who's also quite formative in my younger years. And played by Chloe Annette, the very not Scottish lady who is portraying her in Series 7 and indeed goes on to Series 8. And I read up today has at least a brief role in Back to Earth, is in it? It's pictured.
I believe, and it's been a long time since I've watched Back to Earth, that she appears in a Blade Runner inspired dream sequence.
Got you. And she's I mean, this is no Mark Honor or whatever. People's lives set different courses, but Chloe Annette is now basically retired from acting, I believe, and has been for quite some time, and hasn't really done has not done anything of name recognition above Red Dwarf, although she was in a fascinating sounding late 90s sci-fi TV show called Crime Traveller as well.
I must watch that. Oh, I know exactly what it's going to be without knowing a thing about it. And, I've been reading the words Crime Traveller since I had a Virgin Books complete guide to Red Dwarf or something. Crime Traveller. That's a TV show.
Yeah,
that's one to take to Dave.
If you get around to watching any of that, we'll do that as a Patreon special. It might not be a long Patreon special, but...
No,
we'll do it.
Very, very special. So, my initial reaction to Chloe Annette is the way she's presented as a pretty lady who is flawed and who is socially awkward. I think my heart goes out to her a little bit. As a kid, I wasn't feeling any physical attraction to her, but I think Chloe Annette does a fantastic job, actually. She plays it completely differently, a completely different character to Claire Grogan's Kochanski, but bringing in this layer of uptightness amongst the slobby crew of Starbuck is probably a good way to go, to kind of set it out a different way. And these are all acting choices. I was very careful when I was watching this time round, and there would have been a way to deliver these lines that would have made her seem less fussy, less stuck up. But I think she does a really good job at it. But we've had this show of, as you described it, some lads hanging out in a treehouse, and now there's a smelly girl here, and we aren't going to have as much time because she's fussy. We're not allowed to keep our trainers in the fridge anymore. I think a lot of people watching then would have had Kryten's reaction. And you look at it now, and it does feel like a bit of a mistake not to have had someone with a comic persona that fits in more. But I see what they were going for, and I really respect Chloe Annette's performance in it.
Well, I respect it, but I don't think it really works in the ensemble, and I think you sort of hinted at that when we were messaging a little bit before it as well. I actually can't. This isn't me just being like hung up on Claire Grogan, although not that would be an inexcusable thing. But I can't help but think how much more Claire Grogan's Kochanski might work in this setting, in the sense that she'd just have that confident swagger, and because the Kochanski we meet here isn't, I mean, not that she has to be, not either for my 11-year-old self or my 38-year-old self, but she's kind of not a sexy character, but she's also got no kind of confidence. She's not as nebbish and hung up as Rimmer, although maybe that means that because of that she's also a dilute version. Not that you would have wanted to just be a gender swapped Rimmer, but you've kind of had the full fat version of this sort of hung up middle class character, who's got their pretensions already, and now you've got the kind of slightly diet version as well, apart from anything to do with the gender stuff. So maybe that doesn't work so well. But I agree, the sort of boys' treehouse has been invaded thing it might be another moment along that slow evolution we were talking about, where it just becomes all a little bit undignified, because you are like, these guys with all their hang-ups. Well, Lister is meant to be a grown man, if not an old one, and not one who's been living in normal circumstances for years now. But it just comes across as a bit. It's just so childish, isn't it? And when maybe there's this thing we have in culture where watching, should we say, boys behave childishly around each other, the moment a woman or girl enters the room, you just see that whole thing in a different context.
Yeah, the female gaze to your own ridiculousness.
Yes, yeah, quite. And I think there are, the bits where she's playing it towards the start as well, which it's a good performance. It's maybe not that appealing a performance, or that as I say, integrated performance. But it's funny, you do start to see that relax. You were talking about maybe liking aspects of the last couple of episodes a bit more. You start to see her take on more of a confidence and command, don't you? And even a sort of swagger of her own, where it's like, Lister talks to her about sex at one point, and she, when they're in the sort of dune buggy thing, and she's just like, not here, too much sand.
Yeah, that's a great exchange. That is a really nice, comfortable level of back and forth that is completely missing through the rest of this series.
And there's not as much of Lister even gently sexually harassing as I remembered there might be, and I sort of feared there might be, although there's some. Obviously, I mean, one of them you could say is when he thinks she's ended up in his bed, where you could say it's kind of fair enough given the circumstances.
Yeah.
And it's actually an unattractive woman, which is also one of the oldest tricks in the book. I mean, a zombie. I mean, it's a bit stronger than that, but yeah, it's funny actually, because think about the sort of you might say one of the meta reasons why Chloe Annette's in the show, or at least is in the way she is. I was thinking of the sort of sexual objectification of women still in sci-fi fantasy and everything, but certainly in the 90s. I was looking at the Star Trek stuff. I was looking up that Voyager, I think, had either just or was just about to introduce the 7 of 9 character, for example, in 97. And I was thinking about my own sort of, just pre-adolescent sort of preoccupation. I was at the right age where I would notice it more when pretty women were in things, put it that way, and the kind of things they were giving them to wear and that sort of thing. And it's funny, isn't it? Because, I was saying Kochanski's not a sexy character, but they do give her those kind of very, I mean, the form-fitting, but also those kind of almost like fetish gear style red trousers to wear, which are so distinctive, especially if you are starting to notice that thing more in your own life. And it's not, but again, she's not an overly sexualized character, despite that. It's weird. It's almost like a weird halfway house.
Yeah, I don't think, and it's something that's wrong with this entire series, that nothing's been completely thought through, nothing has been completely conceptualised, and there's never a sense that the creative team sat round and everyone decided what they were going to do. It's just as if it was just left into everyone's hand. The costume designers decided that this is the way Kochanski's going to be, the actress has decided on something else, and the writer has thought something else, and the other actors who have been in the show for a long time have already probably worked out how they're going to play off of her. It takes a long time for chemistry to develop between them. It does get there, as you say, particularly in those last 2 episodes, and I assume it was shot in order, but for a long time you are just watching a character kind of superimposed over the top of everybody else.
What do you think about, because this is sort of linked to Kochanski, but it's going back to Kryten slightly, is what do you think about the kind of needy Kryten, I guess, like, I don't know what you'd call him, but like kind of the conceit of making him more jealous, essentially, because that's a big, we didn't talk about the Pride and Prejudice episode, I think it's called Beyond a Joke, isn't it, where the whole sort of first third of that, almost like if it was a Simpsons episode, the sort of setup bit at the start is the Pride and Prejudice simulation, but it particularly comes into a head there, but the idea that Kryten is now like psychopathically jealous and insecure. I thought a bit where that worked was where he actually talks about why he is, because he has this, actually, if you really think, I mean, they all have traumatic backgrounds, certainly. I mean, Rimmer's literally a dead man walking and stuff like that. But like, Kryten actually did have, you were hinting at the sort of skeleton stuff about his origin, the being, was it killing / being abandoned by the crew of the Nova 5, and I like it when they actually give a reason to it, but then when they've done that, to keep harping on it and keep making it a thing he's doing right through to those finale episodes, it's a bit much, I thought.
Yeah, no, it becomes very irritating as a viewer, and I think that there was a more grounded way for Llewellyn to approach it as well, but he completely goes into cartoon mode on that, and he kind of stays there, and he plays Kryten as a toddler who's been spurned, and that's not where the character's been previously, and yeah, it's an element that should have been handled much better. I think the idea of him having these very understandable fears could be explored in an interesting way, and there's a lot about Beyond the Joke that's about his perception of himself, but much like Demons and Angels, there's parts of it that's genuinely unpleasant, like getting into the addiction stuff, which I don't feel like fits with what this show is. It all gets it a little bit too lost in tone.
Oh, you're talking about Abel, Kryten's kind of twin, almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that is dark. Yeah.
It's and the character of the Gelf, it's played really straight and horribly as well. There's another kind of horror moment in here. There's the horrors of addiction, even though he does redeem himself, and then it goes out with the worst line that you could possibly end on, the single, most obvious dad joke.
Oh, do you mean when they're eating? Well, no, it's there's two almost, aren't there? Because there's that one, and then they go back to the Pride and Prejudice simulation, and they just have, it's not even a line. They just have them like belching fire because of a hot curry, and I was like, what? It's not even, you've not even put a punchline in, like that was so strange. But I think is that the one that Robert Llewellyn wrote some of? But I don't mean that to put it all on him, but I mean it's like a patchwork. It's a bit of a botched job.
Yeah, that's it. So that episode, I think, had a hell of a lot of potential to it. And I like those early scenes in Pride and Prejudice world as well. I like seeing these characters walk around in their holodeck. I think it's a little bit underutilised, actually, as a storytelling device in Red Dwarf. But away from that, exploring Kryten in this way, it just feels really overdone. It's probably my least favourite out of a series that I don't particularly like very much.
Yeah, it's interesting. You say with the holodeck and stuff, it's not all done that way, but they are, maybe with a mind on the American audience and the increased ambition, so to speak, of the show. They're putting this stuff in, aren't they? They're putting in the political thriller stuff in Ticket to Ride. They're putting in the sort of James Bond action man parody stuff in Stoke Me a Clipper, and this does have a fairly accurate, actually, only slightly exaggerated version of particularly the sort of 95 BBC iconic Pride and Prejudice, which was one of the few adult pieces of television I would have watched at this age, actually. So kind of even at the time, I got why how that woman is doing quite a good Alison Steadman, for example, and things like that. It's got enough of that in it, but it just makes the whole thing feel more dislocated, doesn't it? It's the more sort of genre parody, and Red Dwarf had always trodden lightly on genre parody. I'm thinking of like the Casablanca references at the end of Camille and things like that. But to have it just sort of cropping up in different directions every episode makes the whole thing feel even more at sea, somewhat.
I think there's a real motivation from the production team that goes unsaid throughout this entire series, which is, please give us money to make a film. I really want to make a film. Can I make a film? And again, there's just parts of the fact they can prove that, and that's supposedly the reason for Chloe Annette's casting, apart from Groden being busy, was also Hollywood producers that said, but you've got to have an attractive lady in it. You've got to have a pretty lady, otherwise we won't be able to sell this. Yeah,
no, definitely. It's like a series of mini pilots in that sense, isn't it? And you were talking before about some of the uncomfortable humour and like Llewellyn overdoing it. I was thinking again of it's funny because Fawlty Towers came up when I was talking about the British Empire, but the bit with I think it's in Epideme where Kryten comes in to aggressively dust inside all the wardrobes and stuff because he thinks Kochanski's in there. That's fully Fawlty Towers, isn't it? And that's Basil thinking there's a woman in the hotel room. It's shtick, and there's a lot of shtick in this, a lot of different bits. I mean, you could argue about the sort of good taste of the entirety of Lister losing his arm as a sort of conceit, but arguably one of the funnier bits where he's Craig Charles is just gurning and trying to pick up the ball with the hydraulic arm and everything. That's it. It's giving them these little sketch bits to do, isn't it? Which is Red Dwarf's always done bits and pieces of that, and I think that at least kind of works. But whether a whole semi-realistically portrayed sort of disability trauma plotline has a place in Red Dwarf, you could argue that as well.
Yeah, again, much like the addiction, that kind of lands. It doesn't quite stick the landing, that whole stuff. And it's a shame because those episodes are, as I say, the best of the series in terms of writing, in terms of the characters being believable and harkening back to the earlier versions of themselves. I love the conversations with the virus, not just because of the very talented voice actor, but the way it's written and the kind of individual way that each character reacts, excluding the cat, who doesn't really get much to do, as per usual. And I love Kochanski coming good at the end of that and finding a solution that makes a lot of sense and is true to her as well and her intelligence.
Yeah, it's like a genuinely clever solution, isn't it? Using the sort of medical knowledge she has, and it's just, and it's been set up fairly as well in a way. They've kind of given you all the pieces. That's kind of an example of. I mean, you wouldn't want to doing that in every episode, but like that's kind of a way in which she could work, isn't it? And I don't know. God help me, I don't know when the next I'll rewatch Series 8 will be, but it'd be interesting to see if they sort of do that again with her successfully, even for part of it.
I doubt it. Having not revisited Series 8 for a while, I don't think I think she gets thrown onto the same pile as the cat, as someone who has to stand around and is given the occasional line.
Yeah, and of course, for people who don't know the show, although I don't know why you listen to this if you don't, the Series 8 has the return of Chris Barry pretty much straight away, and that's it kind of reverts to a sort. Although you have this one full series where Chris Barry and Chloe Annette are both around, which may or may not be an interesting dynamic, but it's not something we revisited for the purposes of this. Well, James, I kind of want you to. There's a lot to touch on there, obviously, and I think we did a fair bit of it, but I just wanted to sort of say, overall, do you have any kind of closing thoughts on Series 7 and kind of the experience of rewatching it in 2024 that you've just had?
Rewatching it has been fun, as it is always to revisit something that's kind of seminal and important to you. But I can't stand by this with a normal person and say, you have to see this. There's such a strange tone throughout this series, and there's a downbeatness as well that meshes up against that comedy. And there's always been a kind of howling depression at the centre of this show, the hopelessness of it, the fact that that he's not going to get back to Earth, that it's 3 million years away and you're utterly alone. But for this, the way that the notes of drama are played, they are all the way down the deep end of the scale, and the comedy's all the way down at the other side of the scale as well, and they don't mesh in a way that makes sense for TV. It reminds me, I mentioned Buffy earlier, it reminds me of Series 6 of Buffy, where the stupid comedy and the darkness just don't go well together. They've completely lost that way to manage things. I think some of the cast really miss the studio audience, which is the way this had always been done previously. Craig Charles, it's really noticeable, suddenly starts getting into Robot Wars voice a couple of times as Lister, which he'd never done before. And I think a TV audience would have shaken him out of that, and I think it would also have, if not modulated what Llewellyn was up to, it would have made it seem less odd and grating, because the laughter would have been there, and he would have known when to hit the pocket and when to continue.
Yeah, or they would have got a take at least where he hit those notes right. No, I agree, and I think there's something just about that we've been talking a little bit about the perspective from the present day on it as well, where we just know that Red Dwarf didn't go on with this being a brief, weird tonal blip to being great again, or even good again, really, arguably, I'd say. I'd be interested to hear people who defend the later series and stuff, and as I say, some of that's coming from a position of ignorance for me, so fair play. But I think there is a sort of melancholy to the fact that this is sort of Red Dwarf dying in a way, isn't it, and not really dying in a way it probably would have chosen.
Yeah, completely.
Well, and indeed hasn't chosen.
No, it's completely zombie dwarf at this stage, and it's the same people making the same mistakes and telling the same joke patterns, and that's again something that always there. Rimmer would have his misquoting of Space Tour directives. The cat would say it's as unfashionable as a certain thing, but to use that musical metaphor once more, it's like we're still playing the same tune in exactly the same way after all these years. It's just that our hands have gotten a lot more tired as we've done it.
Yeah, and actually, just on that, I thought one thing that's to be said about Series 7 is when Lister and Kryten are playing the guitar together in that last episode. Sounds surprisingly good for Lister.
Yeah, he can strum, but he can't hold a chord structure on his hand.
No, not even with his trusty robot pal. But yeah, thanks James for joining me for that. That's really enjoyed chatting to you about that, and I think there's more to say, but it might be interesting to revisit other bits of Red Dwarf at a later date, or indeed some of the books in more detail. But yeah, thanks. I knew that'd be a great chat, and really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave, very much. I appreciate your time.
Not at all. Is there anything you'd like to tell anyone about that you've been up to recently?
So I am a podcaster. It's one of my hobbies. I like doing it. I like chatting to interesting people like David about things that matter to me. So the longest one, and one that David very kindly referred to already, was Pex Lives, which is where we go through Doctor Who, the entire classic series, 1963 to 1989. We've been doing that now for about 11 years, and as you might expect, Doctor Who takes up an increasingly small part of those shows. We still cover the episodes, but we also use it as an excuse to get to records we've never heard, movies we've never seen, and it's just us being mates and shooting the shit. I do a couple of music-based podcasts. For example, me and our mutual friend of the show, Kit Power, do a podcast about, well, it's going to be about rock and roll discographies, but at the moment we're working through Springsteen, and he's going to, take up the next 20 months. So that's called We Learnt More from a 3-Minute Record Than We Ever Learned at School. There's also another one that's occasional, but we just recorded a comeback episode that I'm very proud of. Look for it soon, of Pop Can Never Save Us, which is me and the brilliant Holly Boson as we go through the top 5 charting records and hopefully some unexpected takes on those as well. And I do other podcasts, but those are the main ones that are currently going around. You can find more information about me on Pex Lives, which is on the Twitter page there. I'm on Bluesky as James Later Murphy, which is my name, James, Latermurphy. And yeah, if you want to get to my Patreon, it's patreon.com/Jim Slater.
And all that, and find James talking about Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers and Backwards, primarily, on that I Don't Speak German podcast that I mentioned. It is Backwards, isn't it?
I believe, it's been a while since I've had that conversation, but I believe it was just Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers.
Oh, I think you're right, yeah. And I think the second one might be called Better Than Life as well. So it's so that was just wrong on every single level. But yes, here I'm talking very intelligently about Red Dwarf novels with a couple of other guys on that, with Jack and Daniel, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Yep. Wonderful. Yeah, all great stuff. Really appreciate that, James. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you, mate. Have a nice evening.
You too, mate. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll be back again before too long. See you soon.
If you're in trouble, he will save the day. He's brave and he's fearless, come what may. Without him, the mission would go astray. He's Arnold, Arnold, Arnold Rimmer. Without him, life would be much grimmer. He's handsome, trim, and no one slimmer. He will never need a Zimmer. He's Arnold, Arnold, Arnold Rimmer, more reliable than a garden's trimmer. He's never been mistaken for your Brinner. He's not bald and his head doesn't glimmer. Master of the wit and the repartee, his command of space directives is uncanny. How come he's such a genius? Don't ask me. Ask Arnold, Arnold, Arnold Rimmer. He's also a fantastic swimmer. And if you play your cards right, then he just might come around for dinner. He's Arnold, Arnold, Arnold Rimmer. No rhymes left now apart from Quimmer. We hope they fade us out before we get to Schlimmer. Fade out, you stupid glimmer.
You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.